Yeah, I had actually just left Marvel maybe 6 or 8 months before that or something. And Andy, actually Andy Helfer, our editor, and I grew up across the street from each other. And we never knew it until like, years later. But Andy actually hired me to knock off Justice League Detroit. That was the first part of it. So I did like the last, I think 8 issues, 6 or 8, maybe it was 6 issues of Justice League Detroit, and they said, kill this character and kill that character and kill that character. So I killed Vibe, who is now a TV star, so figure it out, and then basically Andy was telling me about this new Justice League, and he said, Keith doesn't feel confident enough to do the dialogue himself. And I think Keith and I had just started working on a Dr. Fate miniseries together. So we had really just met. And he gave me Keith's first issue with all Keith's little dialogue notes and everything. And I said, this guy's great. He doesn't need me. And he said, yes, he does. And I said, no, he doesn't. And, yes, he does. And I really figured I'll do the first issue or so. Keith will get his confidence up, and that'll be the end of it, And 5 years and 750,000 spin-offs later, not to mention years after that and years after that. So it was like that quote from The Godfather, where every time I try to get out, they pull me back in again. And but it ended up being one of the greatest gigs of my career and one of the greatest creative partnerships that I've ever had.
Speaking of creative partnerships, how did you guys decide tone was there? We really got, honest to God, just as we came about, actually, we didn't even know we were doing a book that had a good sense of humor until what movie did.
Yeah.
That was it. So we realized we were getting bored and stuff. And just as a footnote too, the entire time we were doing Justice League, DC never was under the pressure of what's going to take the humor out of the book. Never was under pressure. It was constant. But we never meant to kind of different. We didn't go to it like that. It just happened.
Yeah, and I would basically follow Keith's lead in the plot and then build on what he'd done in the plot. And Keith put a light tone, but they were pretty straight ahead. The early issues especially were pretty straight ahead superhero stories, but they had a light tone. So I reacted to Keith's light tone, and as I always say, did what I did so well, which was take one idea of his and then repeat it and beat it into the ground, and then he would bounce off that. And somewhere along the way, this sort of humorous undertone became more foreground in the book, but we didn't plan it. Well, that's why we said, what was the design? What did you plan? We didn't plan anything, nothing. The book just kind of happened. We didn't plan this creative partnership. We didn't plan. If anyone planned, maybe it was Andy Helfer, because he was the only kind of sane person keeping the whole thing together.
We didn't make a choice of characters. One of the things we noticed when we knew the book was DC started yanking characters out of the book. We lost Captain Marvel. They wanted Batman out of the book almost the entire time that we were doing the series. So people wonder, why did you have characters like Fire and Ice? You played nicely kind of the local Guardians. The reason was nobody cared about them. We had 3 characters that nobody gave a damn about and put them in the book. Otherwise, DC would become a fuss. As an example, we had Wonder Woman in Justice League Europe. She lasted 1 issue with George Perez, who was on the Wonder Woman book, saying, get her out of the book. They're going to soil her. Going to soil her. That was what we were up against. We liked these characters.
But that was ultimately to our benefit, because the advantage of having these second or sometimes third or sometimes fourth tier characters is nobody cared. So we could do whatever we wanted with them, and we made them our own, And that, if we had been writing Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern, we would have not had the freedom that we had.
I think back then, DC was grateful that Justice League sold so well, and yet DC also resented the hell out of the fact that Justice League sold so well. I was told once by Dick Giordano told me one time that you don't understand, humor is off genre.
Really, truly?
Yeah.
Wow. See, I've never heard that before. I'm glad I came to this panel.
I'm sure I must have complained about it.
You probably complained to Andy, and I never heard about it, That's so interesting, because that book was a big hit. We ended up, basically with our own little line of books. Between, Justice League Europe, Justice League... Hey. So we were making a lot of money for the company. It's amazing that they would still be going, we don't like this funny stuff, you know?
What was your process like? So you guys get partnered up. I know you were doing the
Partnered up is, we were a team that never really reacted on any level. I would do the plot, I would hand it to the DC would send it to Mark, wouldn't tell him a thing about it. He just vammed his way through the plot, I'd read what he wrote, I'd pick a couple of ideas out of it, oh, that's neat, I'd build on it, and we just rolled on like that. We fed off one another through the entire series.
Because we always say we worked in glorious isolation, you know, because it was like if Abbott and Costello, and, you know, Abbott's in one nightclub and Costello's in another, you know, and they're doing some kind of comedy routine. But that's true. Most of the time I didn't know what was coming in the book, so they would, back in those days, FedEx me the plot, and I would just sit down with it and write the first thing that came into my head. If I didn't understand what was happening in the story, I'd call the editor and go, what's going on here? I don't know who this character is. But that was the fun of it, and I was given the freedom that most people will not give someone who's scripting from their plot, which is like, go ahead, do whatever you want. And that's what made the book so great. So he gave me the freedom to do what I wanted, and then he would build on that, and I would take these wonderful ideas and wonderful bits that Keith would put in the plots and build on that. And we always say it was like a game of tennis. You know, he'd hit the ball to me, I'd hit it back. But we were never in the same room doing this. We were, you know, I was in my house, he was in his, and we'd meet up at DC, you know, maybe once a month, and we'd have lunch with Andy, and that was about it.
Now, the other person that's just as well known for this is Kevin Maguire.
Who's he?
He's an artist, and I've worked with once or twice.
He said I couldn't be involved in the media.
How did he come to be involved in this project? Because again, just as iconic, it's iconic for his issue.
Sympathy. He used to stand outside the DC offices with a tin cup begging for, will work for comic books, the sign said, and Andy took pity. No, Andy found him, right?
Andy found him, and after, it's just weird, after having me plotting the book, which I had no experience in plotting a book, and then putting Mark on the dialogue of the book, and Mark was not known for this particular type of dialogue, he was known for deeper stuff. They put Kevin on the book, who was based on a Batman picture. Now, I don't think Kevin did a big portfolio or anything. And he goes, look at this picture. He hands me a picture of Batman, and it was Clint Eastwood as Batman. So that's your artist. And it was like, if you had an editor who decided that he wanted to kill a book, he couldn't have done a better job than Andy did in assigning.
In hiring us?
He was just showed up. And he was, he used to work in Andy's office, because otherwise he couldn't make a deadline. He had a little desk in the corner. He did. And Andy would put it in the corner.
With a little chain attached to the desk.
Not let him leave the office until we got a certain amount of work done. And it was weird.
But just the way we got these third string characters, and it ended up being to our benefit, we didn't know anything about Kevin really, and he was the perfect artist for the book because Kevin does the best acting in comics. Facial expressions, gestures, reactions, and the kind of stuff we were writing depends on that. Another artist could have come along and drawn that book, and I always say this, we might not be having this discussion today. Kevin was the perfect one, and every artist that came after him had that example of that first year and a half that he did to follow that, you know? So it was really fortuitous that this person that we had no clue who he was turned out to be the absolute perfect person for the book.
Did you ever adjust plots or to adapt to his style? Did he do that, or did he adapt his style to?
He adapted his style. Yeah, we're too intransigent to change our plot for him.
He stuck to the plots pretty much. Yeah.
But the beauty, you know, as Keith was saying recently, the beauty is that then Kevin would take whatever was in the script, and he could add comedy beats and reactions and things. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So there would be a line and maybe a reaction and then the next line, as opposed to having it all happen in the same panel. Do you know? I know Kevin's frustration, which we discovered years later, is that sometimes he would get the plot and he'd be drawing from the plot. And I'd be home writing the script and changing the story. And then, the lettering would come and he'd be like, if I didn't know that was the line, I would have drawn something different. But his art was so good that it always worked anyway.
The book is known for humor, and Keith, I think I saw an interview where it was the first time I was exposed to this term, dramatic whiplash, where you guys would write this funny stuff, but then, oh my God, you get serious, and it would drive home the emotion of the moment. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of that to the book and giving it, I don't know, an extra sense of gravitas?
I never thought of it giving this to gravitas. I just like the idea. Of punching somebody while they're laughing. And so, or I'd be doing the book to be light and tone, and a serious threat would come along, and I do that serious threat, and I go back to light and tone because I figured, well, I don't have to write it. It's work.
And also, because it wasn't a comedy book. They weren't cartoon characters. They were real people. At least they were to us, So that just like real life, you could go from the light moment to the dark moment, just as life does, and you went with it because these characters were three-dimensional and real.
Right.
Like an old episode of MASH or something where it's like really hysterically funny one minute, and then it's deadly serious, and that really has a lot of impact.
I don't think with Justice League, at least as far as I looked at it, they're a group that's together, they're friends. Now, when I get together with a group of my friends, it's usually pretty damn funny. You're ranking one another, giving one another a hard time. You're not sitting there getting all serious and weepy. And that was the thing I tried to, in the plots, apply to the Justice League. They're friends, they get together, they goof around. People in Booster will do something stupid, or Guy Gardner will turn into an asshole, but they're still friends. They back one another up. It was just like based on the way I was having experiences with my friends.
Right, and I guess generationally it must just be the same, because I related it to, growing up in Brooklyn with my friends when I was a teenager and a young adult, and the banter and the merciless kidding and, staying up late and laughing all night. And so those people were, sometimes when people emphasize the comedy is what actually emphasized the reality as far as I'm concerned. You know what I mean?
No,
that in a lot of ways I found those characters much more real than a lot of these more angsty, serious characters that I wrote a lot of, But I think the humor made it more real, not less real.
That has to be why it resonated with people, right? I mean, reading an issue, it is like hanging out with your friends.
Yeah, that's the way it felt like for me writing it. I have no idea why it resonated with people. It just resonated with people, and I thought, okay, I'll keep doing that. I had no idea. It's weird. I no offense, but I really gave very little thought to you people when I
Did you all have favorite characters you enjoyed writing more than others?
Yeah, I like Beetle Booster and Fire and Ice. Those the teams there, but I'd say out of all the characters in the book, Beetle was probably my favorite.
I would probably say the same, and I love the Beetle and Booster dynamic. I also liked writing the Martian Manhunter because he was a fantastic straight man, fantastic straight man for the rest of them. But there were so many wonderful characters sewn into that book. But, I think when people think of that Justice League, they think of Beetle and Booster.
Are there any questions from the audience at this point? Anybody? This distinguished panel of gentlemen. Yes, sir.
Could you talk a little bit about my money, the most important character in the series, Norm?
Did I pay you to say that?
Go for it.
I would have mentioned Nort, but I have an inordinate love of Nort. He's probably the silliest character we ever created, and there's just something. We talked about this. We went out to lunch with Andy one day, and we were just batting around ideas, and I think Keith decided we needed a new Green Lantern, which I don't even know why, because we had Guy Gardner. Yeah. And we were batting around ideas, and somehow, for those of you that are old enough to at least have seen a rerun of The Honeymooners, Art Carney's character is called Ed Norton. And we thought, wouldn't it be great to have like an Art Carney complete just goofball? And that's where Nort came from the name Norton. And as I started to write him, I found a lot of the young Woody Allen in there too. So sort of a combination of Art Carney and Woody Allen. And anytime we do anything, I say, can we bring Nort in? And he's like, yeah, all right, But I love that character.
So the book expands out, and you keep adding characters, and then there's more more and more spin-offs. Was that surprising?
Yeah.
When the word came down, they said, hey, we want to do Justice League Hero. What's the reaction there?
She's like, okay.
Yeah.
All right, you're going to pay me? Okay.
I guess I can do that. I remember they had to rank, you didn't want to do it.
You know what? Because we were doing Justice League, and then we had Justice League Quarterly, which was this huge book. You know, was it 80 pages, 4 times a year? And then I was working on these spin-offs. I was doing Mr. Miracle and a Martian Manhunter miniseries and a couple of other things. So it was like, there were a couple of years where 90% of what I was doing was Justice League, you know, or Justice League related. So we started Justice League Europe, and it was just one Justice League too many for me. Yeah. And I think after issue 8, I might have come back for one issue later, issue 8 or 9, and then I said, I'll back off on this one. But Keith kept going with the whole thing, man, to the last breath.
How do you feel about giving each book its own voice? Because they're different, and they're both the last one played, but from a writing perspective, how do you separate them and give them their own identity while keeping that lighter tone?
I just don't like the French. It was just the idea that, I figured Justice League, in America, they're accepted, they're heroes, they're loved, and I thought, well, in France, then let's have them be just interlopers, and they're not looked at as heroes. Let's play off of that. That was the only thing that's in America was the fact that it took off. Like I said, I didn't go into the book with any expectations to where the book was going. As I did the book, the characters eventually sort of line themselves up, and it sounds corny, but eventually they start telling their own stories.
It's true.
It's really transcribing it.
Same thing with the dialogue. You know, I would get these guys. We didn't plan, Beetle and Booster, they're going to be the funny guys in the group. You know, he put together a scene with them and set up a situation. I got them talking to each other. And just as it is with real people, there's chemistry between characters, just as there's chemistry between people. And then we go, oh, that's interesting. And then he throws in another scene, and then I play with it. And then he throws in another. And suddenly, you have a relationship, you know? I have to say, I'm glad I stuck around on Justice League Europe long enough we did an issue where the Justice League Europe went to night school to learn French. And it turns out the Injustice League is also in the class. And that's one of my favorite things that we've ever done. So I'm glad I stuck around for that one.
Other questions from the audience so far?
Yes. I have a question. We continue with the French thing. There's a
Don't get him started on the French.
I'll make a comment, I think it's by Metamorpho, about talking about how the Three Stooges are so much better dubbed in French. And is that from a personal experience that you guys have?
That was dialogue. That wasn't me.
Was it one of my issues? Do you know? I just probably thought it was a funny thing to say. Although I remember being a kid and you'd flip around and I would find the Spanish station and then you see the Three Stooges in Spanish and it was twice as funny, you know, because all the nyuk, 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 that was all still them, and then you'd have all this Spanish stuff. So that's probably where that came from.
I mean, in this age of having everything at our fingertips now, I actually still continue to look for Three Stooges dubbed in French on YouTube, and I can't find it.
Yeah. I never saw them in French, but I definitely saw them in Spanish.
Yes, sir. Second row.
So I am especially interested in how you guys got Justice League 3000. So it's like you were talking about how DC was scared to give you these main characters, and then years later, you sort of do a version of this, the main Justice League.
But they weren't the main characters.
Right.
They still weren't allowed to have the main. They had to want to be characters that were cloned, but the cloning had to go wrong. It couldn't be, you know, oh, they cloned Superman, he cloned Superman, and they screwed it up, and we just weren't allowed, whereas I'm still not allowed to use these characters.
But if you recall, don't tell anybody this. In the very beginning, we got a lot of pushback. Do you remember? On the first issue, it was too funny for them. And we got a lot of pushback, and we went through a whole behind-the-scenes thing about the tone of the book, and then now he remembers, and then we basically agreed, don't worry, you know, we'll behave, and then within a few issues we just did whatever we wanted, and the book became exactly the same thing that we always do.
I liked it. As a matter of fact, I think it was right after that I Supergirl into the book, which even pissed them off even more.
Yeah, we had a few difficult conversations when that book launched. Yeah.
I walk into this and I go, it's a comic book. Well, for God's sake, it's not curing cancer. You know? It's like, you can't kill him. Yes, I can, because he doesn't exist. You know how easy it is to bring him back? Who is it? Oh, you're back. It's just, no.
That's true.
I can't deal with people who go, Superman wouldn't do that. Superman doesn't exist. You know, just stop it.
This is how you tell them?
Yeah.
Yes, sir, front row.
I seem to remember that originally it was going to be Kevin Maguire on JL-3000, and of course it ended up being Howard Porter.
Yeah.
How did it turn out that way?
Kevin screwed up.
I don't know if it was that. I don't really remember what it was, but I was very disappointed that he didn't end up doing the book. And it's just one of those things. As I said, there was a lot of push-pull behind the scenes on the beginning of that book. And beyond that, we can let it go.
Yes, sir.
What?
The One Punch.
idea was
Whose
behind
idea was
the
One
One
Punch?
Punch.
Well, it was in the plot. But
Yeah.
You
I didn't have to do a lot with that scene because it was all there in the plot, and I just had to throw in a little bit of dialogue. It was such a hysterical situation, and who thought that like all these years later people are still talking about One Punch? You
I
know?
just thought, Batman hits Guy Garner. He's going to go down. That was it. That was, and I thought, that's it. It'll never be talked about again.
Right.
And that's just stuck. It's just,
Years later, I did an episode of Batman: Brave and the Bold where I ripped us off and threw that scene in with. It was great. It was great.
I mean, it's an iconic panel. It's just the fist from a side view.
And again, then it's the way Kevin drew it,
Yeah.
which also sold it.
Next question. Yes.
I love these characters too. Thanks to you guys, I always have. How do you feel about their treatment since you guys wrote the book?
Don't care. Don't care. I honestly, when I walk off a book, the character is thrown back into the common pot, and I just hope the next foster parent to come along takes good care of the kid. And I don't care. I don't care. We had our stories, and it doesn't invalidate anything we did.
And as the years passed and we kept revisiting them with like formerly known as the Justice League, and I can't believe it's not the Justice League. And even really, when we did Justice League 3000, we folded that universe into it. I finally came to the conclusion that our stories really exist in their own universe that have nothing to do with the mainstream DC universe, So they're all over there having fun, and the rest of the DC universe is doing whatever they do. And that's, also everyone's obsessed these days with things being a universe. I don't care that much about that. It's fun, but ultimately you want good stories, regardless of what universe. Like every movie company wants to have a universe, like the Marvel Universe. And it doesn't always work. Just tell us a good story.
Continuity, I have no respect for it. Continuity, I have no respect for it at all. Consistency,
Right.
yeah, I can have some respect for that. But continuity will choke an idea to death.
We talked about this recently. I often had no idea who some of these characters were. He would put them in the plot. I had never heard of Booster Gold. It's not an insult. I just had never read that book. I don't think maybe I'd heard the name. And so I didn't go back and read like stacks of old Booster Gold stories. I just followed whatever he did and built on it in my script. And years later, we were actually writing the Booster Gold book. And that's when that's who Booster Gold is. Oh, isn't that, who's Skeets? I never heard of him, So, like, Skeets was never in our run, but I'd never heard of him, so I didn't know he was missing, So, we just, a lot of these characters were like, I'm just doing whatever Keith's putting in the plot, I'm going to play with that, and whatever version existed before, I figured some editor would call me up and yell at me if I went too far,
Keith, can you elaborate on continuity versus consistency a little bit?
Yeah, continuity strangles the story. I don't even understand continuity. I guess that means what continuity means that if I'm writing a book in June, I have to know that in June issue of Wonder Woman, she's in Chicago, so I can't have her in Los Angeles. It doesn't make any sense. So it's like, I don't think continuity should be part of comics. It's a comic book. But consistency, that basically means that Superman has a set series of powers. He's consistent from issue to issue. He doesn't suddenly show up with a new superpower. He doesn't suddenly show up with a new character out of the blue that he's known for a while. I don't even understand how continuity became an issue, except it was a game that was played by fans. No offense. A game that was played by fans, and then as fans began coming into the industry and becoming professionals, they bought the game with them. I just wish no one would talk about continuity anymore. Consistency. Make sure your characters are consistent. You know, if Robin dies in Batman, he should also be dead in Green Lantern. That's consistency. You know, continuity is more concerned with when Robin died and where was everyone else. It kills creativity. I can't tell you the amount of times I've been told, oh, you can't tell that story. Why not? Well, that villain's off Earth at that time. Who cares? It's like, I find it hard to believe that, like, Stan Lee or Jack Kirby, the people that did Marvel when it first started, there was no continuity of Marvel. The fans did it. They figured it out.
But Stan and Jack and Ditko made it more of a coherent universe where characters knew each other and bumped into each other, but it was loose. And kind of what you're saying. And then when people like us came into the business, and it was a lot of that. I know when I first started in the business, there was a lot of like, I want to tell the story of what happened between panels 2 and 3 of that issue 14 years ago. I got over that quickly, but I think a sense of continuity in an interlocked universe is a really nice thing. But after 40 years, 50 years, it really begins to weigh it down, and that you have to worry about what happened in an issue 40 years ago. So I think Keith is absolutely right. Be consistent with the characters, and continuity. Like I said, there was a point in my career where I was as obsessed with it too, and then I got over that, and now I figure if I screw it up, someone will call me and yell at me about it.
Continuity is the mindset that says, well, Superman met Nixon and Kennedy and this and that. Well, Superboy, okay, Superboy met Kennedy and this guy and that character. How can that happen? And then they start figuring, well, those should be time travel back. And I'm thinking, who the hell cares? Was it a decent story? Odds are you're not going to. Just leave it alone and just make the character consistent.
So when y'all came back to the Justice League formerly known as Justice League, I think I know the answer to this. Did you go and look up what happened to the characters between?
No, but the odd thing about that book is that when we were nearing the end of it, I think it was the second one.
I can't believe when they were doing all that weird stuff. Yeah.
Here we've done this whole series with Justice League Max and Max, and then they say to us, oh, Max is going to be a villain in True Blue Beetle. And I said, well, then they said, well, and just end your story fast. And so that's why I think that, and they live happily ever after.
Well, I think actually Carlin threw that in at the end, yeah, because
We just had, it was like, I was told, the characters you're using, a bunch of them are going to die.
And I didn't know what was going on with what they were planning, and I know they had all this horrible stuff happen to Sue Dibney, and I'm writing, in the dialogue, I created this whole other subplot for the second series where Ralph thinks Sue is pregnant. And it's a complete running gag through the whole series. And in the end, I was going to have her say, and I am pregnant. And they said, you can't do that. I didn't know why I couldn't do that, because I didn't know anything about their plans with Max and Beetle and all that stuff. But I think Kevin heard, and that's why the very last panel, I think Kevin drew of Max and Beetle and Booster together laughing to kind of, but that's why I think our stories exist. That Max and Beetle, they're off in their universe, we're off in ours,
Now, how are sales on those books? I understand, like, sales are almost.
On which
For formerly known as
They were great. They were really well, good selling books in DC books. You said, wow, those books sold really well. Let's let her do that again.
Yeah, formerly known as won the Eisner.
I'm sorry, that's what it
Yeah,
was.
we won the Eisner for that, which was, we were like, what? We won the what?
I love the way that they said, well, you were nominated for the Eisner, and then we win the Eisner, and we were nominated and stuff like that, and none of us were sent out there, none of us were put out there by DC.
No, we weren't there for the awards or anything. It was so sad.
Like what we did.
Questions from the audience? Did you ever get any indication why they didn't like what you did, or it just wasn't the tone they were going?
Humor is off genre. I mean, yeah, humor is off genre. That's the phrase I keep remembering DC telling me. It's off genre. It's off genre. Superheroes aren't supposed to be funny. It's off genre.
At the same time, we were, especially on the first run, we were making a lot of money for the company, and they okayed all these spin-offs, and so they won't, you know, so yeah, I don't know. The good thing is that for the most part, Andy Helfer protected us from all that, whatever chatter was going on, you know, and we were just free to work on the stories. And if anybody had a complaint, they'd go to Andy and complain, and he's not going to tell us. He wants us to just be free to create. So I cannot undervalue the contribution of Andy Helfer to our original run of Justice League. He was so vitally important to that book.
Do you think it was easier because you're in a free internet time and people aren't hitting up social media to talk about the scuttlebutt, and you're not having?
I'm not allowed on social media.
And you're all getting an idea why, right?
I was told by Dan Video just to stay off social media. I said, why? And he goes, because I don't want to have to fire me. That's the truth. So I just stay off social media. I think I have a Facebook site where I was going to go on social. I don't know why. I was going to go on social media, and I decided against it. So I have a website, and I just wrote in one sentence, and it's I like fudge. And I don't go to this site anymore, but apparently people have been gathering there and just chatting. It's become like the corner pop shop in the 50s.
That's funny. And they're all talking about fudge, right?
I don't go, I don't do with social media.
You should go on Twitter under a fake name and say rude things about yourself.
If I go on Twitter, it means I've got to interact with people, and I got into this job because I sit at home and work alone.
For the Justice League reunion book, the formerly known as, was this something that you approached DC with, or did DC approach you to do it?
I was approached by DC. I don't know whether, did you pitch them or did they pitch us?
No, Dan Masper.
Yeah. I remember some years before Andy Helfer had wanted to get us back to, we were going to do like the last Justice League story or something like that, and DC wouldn't approve it, I think. Yeah. And then somehow Dan Raspler got approval and pulled us together. And I always say this, but it's true, so I'll repeat it again. What was in my mind at the time was, if you've all seen those horrible TV reunion movies, you know, where they get a cast of a TV show back together 10 years later, or 15, and usually 9 out of 10 times they're just awful. They're just awful. And I really thought, you know, what if the three of us get together again, and this is just a horrible, horrible thing. And it only took me about 3 pages to kind of click back in, and I always say this as well. We were so stupid. When we were working on Justice League in the 80s on this big hit book, we really didn't give it a second thought. We didn't think about, gee, Keith and I, we really work well together, or we work well. It was just a gig, and we were all working on the gig. And it was only 10 years later, when we were working on formerly known as, that we went, oh, we're pretty good together. And honestly, it took us that 10-year gap, honestly, without exaggeration. Then we said, we got to keep doing this. And in one way, shape, or form, we have continued working together all these years, yeah.
Not that bright.
No, we're not that bright, that's it.
One of my favorite things about formerly known as is that they operate out of the strip mall. The rest of the DC universe, despite them 10 years early being the Justice League, they're not looked at. I mean, was that, I don't know, like, was that answering a response to DC's reaction to it almost? It seems
No,
like.
I seem to recall just the idea of this street level superheroes. I was thinking that, you know, it's the Justice League, they're on the moon and the satellite and stuff like that, and the average person never gets to really interact with the Justice League. It's always presidents or big political characters or super secret government organizations with super villains coming. So I wanted to get a group of characters who were more accessible. So that was the whole idea behind that.
There was a question in the back.
What?
Oh, yeah, I was gonna ask about the genesis of Hero Squared, how that came about.
It came about the way almost everything we've ever worked on together. Keith calls me up and says, I got this idea, do you want to do it? And I say, sure. And he had the basic concept, you know, the basic premise and the setup. And it was the first time we did a creator-owned book, which meant we were completely free. There was no editor who was going to come in and say, you can't do that. Because we'd created our own universe and populated it with our own characters. And it was the same way we'd worked on everything else. He set up a premise, I built on that, I fleshed out the characters, I bounced it back to him, he bounced off of what I did, and it turned in what for me was, I think, my favorite thing that we've ever done together. And if any of you haven't read Hero Squared, we just put out an omnibus last year, I think, with the entire series in it, and it really is my favorite thing we've ever done. So if you like Justice League, I think you'll really like this one.
Other questions? Yes, in the back.
Could you talk a little more about your comedy influences? You mentioned The Honeymooners. Are there other sitcoms or things that...
Monty Python.
Yeah, I love Monty Python as well.
Basically, Monty Python. The whole humor in Justice League, I was thinking Monty Python.
It's a hard thing to say now, but I love the early Woody Allen movies.
Or the Faulty Towers. You actually did a riff on Faulty Towers with the Beefeater.
What else? There's so much stuff. I love the Marx Brothers, you know, so a lot of that classic comedy. I'm also a big fan of old radio, like radio comedy from like the 40s. And there's this, and because it's all so verbal, you know, there's a certain rhythm to that, and a certain sort of rat-a-tat feeling that I tried to have in the dialogue. We were talking about recently also the old, the 1930s movie. Oh, Carry On movies? Did you used to watch those? I used to watch those, yeah. But, you know, the 1930s movies, which were all these comedies like Bringing Up Baby, which were all filled with this really fast back and forth dialogue, back and forth, done so quickly. You know, people talk about, God, there's so much dialogue on the page, but the reason there was so much dialogue on the page was that there was a certain rhythm I was always going for. So one character would say one thing, and it'd be back, and a back, and a back, and a back. You need a lot of balloons for that, you know? And luckily we had really good letterers. Bob Lappin on Justice League was, and I always come back to this, you know, you need every element of the team to work for something to be a hit. And if someone other than Bob Lappin had lettered the book, we might not be talking about it today. Because he had to fit in all this dialogue I put in, and it had to look good and flow, you know? So it's really important. Lettering is so important to a comic book.
Got your late, sir. This has been asked. I apologize. Do you read your dialogue out loud when you finish it?
Most of the time, no. Sometimes, but most of the time, you know, I hear voices in my head, so I don't need to say it out loud. But I really do. You know, the characters take on tone and voice, and I hear it in my head. And kind of going back to something we said probably before you got here, we're kind of following the characters. The characters kind of take on a life of their own. So I may start a conversation between two characters, but they continue it. So it's less of me reading it out loud and more of me following a conversation that I'm hearing in my head, you know?
I work in theater, and I also am a playwright. And I've read some of your stuff out loud with actors.
Really? Oh, that's cool.
And it really stands well. Because zipping along with it. It's exactly kind of His Girl Friday.
Yeah, exactly. So we can take Justice League to Broadway now? Is that what you're saying? Can it be a musical?
When they told Ron Chernow that Lin-Manuel Miranda wanted to turn Hamilton into a Broadway musical, he said a story, and he was like, what?
Right. All right, so everybody, Justice League the Musical is coming soon.
Other questions? Well, this side, like I'm neglecting this side.
Oh, you must have something.
Captain America. Yeah.
Just to get in a question about a little bit of a question about another property movie. Been reading Scooby Apocalypse lately, and to say something maybe about that being kind of like almost a flip side of the Justice League dynamic in terms of you took the Justice League characters that have been traditionally very straight and made them lighter, as you said, and more humorous. And in Scooby Apocalypse, you're taking a property that's been, kind of very light and comic throughout. I think they're making maybe just a shade.
That wasn't us. It was Jim Lee.
Oh, okay.
we ran with it.
Right,
but,
right.
The colonel.
And we were always looking at, one of the movies we kept talking about when we were talking about Scooby Apocalypse was Zombieland, which is a movie that has, the scares are real, but it's a lot of character-based humor as well. And that's what we do. So we essentially took our little formula and stuck it, and we did a horror story with it as opposed to a superhero story with it. And it was one of those, again, you know, he calls me up, want to do Scooby Apocalypse? Okay, you know. But it ended up being a really fun gig, and astonishingly, it lasted 3 years, you know. In this market, that's a pretty amazing thing. And we had a lot of fun with it. Yeah. Anybody?
Yes.
I would like to know more about Justice League Antarctica. And for me, when I read it, it was the first example of like the supervillain sort of psychological deconstruction. You know, you make fun of them.
I'm sorry, I hate to disappoint you. I wanted to do a story about
Penguins.
evil penguins.
All the psychological nuance is all mine. Don't you know that?
That was my motivation.
It's funny because if you ask each of us to list our like 10 favorite Justice League stories, that's always one of them. Because those characters were great too. They were the bad guys, but we treated them just the way we treated our guys. They were real people, and they were basically complete failures as villains. And it was so interesting to just send them off to Antarctica with Nort, of all people. And it's one of my favorite stories that we did.
Who are your favorite villains?
Ones we've used or?
Yeah, that bunch you used in Justice League. Is there a standout villain that you just had the most fun with?
The extremists.
Why is that?
Because they were deliberately done to make fun of Marvel's major characters. Lord Havoc was Dr. Doom. Skull Tracer or whatever.
I still don't know who those characters were, and I was writing it. You know?
Reinhardt was Magneto. They were all based on the guy with one of the guys with the weird curly hair was Dr. Octopus. They were all just based on Marvel characters. It was kind of fun to do that.
How come you didn't tell me that then?
Because you would have screwed it up.
I actually remember really not liking the extremists. I think that was toward the end of the run, and I was like, oh god, I don't know. But they were good stories anyway. I really liked the Injustice League. I thought that they were great because they were really the mirror image of our team. And I also loved our Galactus riff, Mr. Nebula, the intergalactic designer, who would go across the universe redesigning planets, you know.
The Gray Man.
Oh, the Gray Man, right, early in our run, was also a very cool and interesting villain. Yeah.
How was it? You mentioned earlier that Kevin visually had set the tone for the book. Was there ever a learning curve for new artists to come in on your end of it to get to know the strengths, weaknesses?
Let me compliment Keith because he won't compliment himself. The way Keith would do his plots is he would draw little mini comics.
Okay.
You know, and he would draw it, you know, panel by panel. You know, it was very sketchy, but clear as a bell. The storytelling was always clear as a bell. And often when we would get new artists on the book, if they followed exactly what Keith did, it looked great. And if they decided to diverge from what Keith did, I always thought it suffered because his storytelling is so impeccable that even in these little sketched out mini comics that he would do, it was just perfect, you know? So yeah, there was a learning curve, I think. I think a lot of artists probably learned a lot about storytelling from following Keith's plots. Yeah.
I didn't change anything for any artist, no. The artist got the same plots that Kevin got. I didn't adjust my plotting for an artist. I figured that the artist is coming on Justice League. If anyone's got to be adjusting stuff, it's got to be the artist. I'm not going to change around. We've been on this for years. I'm going to change to some guys coming on. No.
We got lucky though, like we got Adam Hughes and a lot of other really good people. Mike McCone when he started out, and yeah, a lot of great people. Ty Templeton, he was excellent. Yeah. But really, again, it was all really inspired by a visual template that Kevin helped establish, you know, and the storytelling that Keith established.
Keith, having that artistic background, how does that factor into writing then? I imagine that makes it a little bit easier. At all?
No, I perfected. It helped me to do the breakdowns faster. But the breakdowns happened after I spent some time. I worked storyboard artist for Batman Beyond for a couple of episodes, and a lot of the breakdowns I did on Justice League stuff came out of that.
Oh, really? That's
So
interesting.
it's, I think the storyboards are going away with that storyboard, so I started applying to the breakdowns. You know, it was just the way I felt most comfortable telling a story, because I can any artist coming in going, well, there was too much plot to fit out the page.
Yeah, I just did it wrong, so just.
And I love writing from his plots. I mean, as the years went by, I'll see the art. I'd rather see the art when it's done, because we have sort of such a mind meld at this point that, a couple of sketched lines and some suggested dialogue, whatever, and I totally get what he's doing, and I can write from his plots. It's so easy.
But you've got
It's
to
so easy.
understand, on the plots, I don't hold back. These characters curse, they swear. I mean, it's pretty horrifying.
It's not horrifying.
Any other questions? Yes, front row.
So, with your perspective on the business over the years, how do you feel about it today, like when you offer a show for downstairs and see the array of talent? How do you feel about the business? How do you think it's evolved?
I don't know, it evolved? No, it's devolved, yeah. It's devolved, I think. First of all, I love new talent. I like new talent. I'll try to help people that I think have got talent, got a knack. I'll try to help them into the industry. I've done it before. I don't feel threatened by them. But now, who is the last brand new character of note to come out of comics? So that pretty much answered the question, didn't it? The fact that nobody has an answer for that, or you've got to think about it. You should be able to pop these names off the top of your head. I mean, so it's like, and now, Mark and I probably couldn't do the kind of stuff we did before, because the mindset would be different. You're thinking about, well, if I do this character for comics, maybe I can move my try screenplay, it'll get me the movie. And to me, comics it's imagination. You're supposed to come up with new characters. You're supposed to come up with new circumstances. You're supposed to come up with new situations. That's part of your job. That's what you do. You don't just regurgitate Dr. Doom or the Joker over and over and over and over again. You got to keep the audience's interest. And if that means that you create a character that then goes on to film and makes a shitload of money, tough. Tough. You didn't recognize the fact that you need the company behind it. The fact that the company's now giving you a certain percentage, it's not a big percentage, that says something, but it really doesn't change the way I work. You've got to
Right. No, it shouldn't change the way you work. And when you sit down to write a story, you're focused on the story, and you can't think about what's going on in the business right now, or this or that, or what the current trend is. You just follow the story. Really the biggest change is that suddenly all these movies and TV shows and this pop culture cachet that we don't have, but the movies have, and you go to conventions unlike this one, which is so purely comics, and there's thousands of people walking around in their costumes and all, 80% of which have never read a comic book, and that's weird to me. That's a very strange phenomena. And the other thing I think is interesting, which I've noticed and others have noticed, is that there's a tone to a lot of these movies and TV shows that I think comes right out of what we did. Like as Keith said, there wasn't a lot of humor applied to these characters before we did that. And right the first Avengers movie, when they got that last scene where they're sitting in the restaurant, that was like right out of one of our books. Or what I always say they did when they announced Legends of Tomorrow, and they said whether they were looking for the tone of our book for the tone for their show. They did. They admitted that publicly. And my joke is, which is only half joking, do we get royalties for tone? We don't.
If you're looking for the tone of the book we did, wouldn't you think that at least call and ask us about the book we did? And basically, when your character is going to become a movie, the first thing that happens is you are cut off. You are not called, you are cut off. You don't get a single say. I'm not going to say in Rocket Raccoon, I won't have a say in Logan. It's just, you're cut off, you're gone. I think I've only gotten one call from one producer ever about a character of mine going into a movie, and it was a disaster. So it's like, you do the comics. Do I expect to get rich off of comics or have a character generate tons of royalties? No.
Well, you can't go in with that expectation.
It's how I make a living.
Right. Just like, we didn't sit down with Justice League and say, let's create a new template for superhero teams and then it'll be a big success. But no, it was like, oh, look, it's a gig. They're going to pay me. Okay, let's have fun, No one can set out to create a new template. I think if you do try to set out to create a new template, you're going to fail miserably.
Yes.
Sort of nuts and bolts question. When you say you get rid of new breakdowns, would you see a plot that he says?
I would write from Keith's plot, a little mini comic that he draws out. That was the plot. Yeah, with the breakdown. So I could dialogue from his breakdowns. And actually, over the years, I think it was better, like I said before, where Kevin would say, but I was drawing to, So this way, if I'm writing from Keith's breakdowns, then the artist can have the breakdowns and my dialogue, so they know everything that's going into the script. And I would much, much rather, just because I'm so comfortable after all these years, just write from his breakdowns, because they are just so smooth and impeccable.
You still do it that way?
Yes. That's what we did on Scooby, exactly the same way. Yeah.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah. Well, even if it is, it's too late now.
Too late.
Yeah.
Other question? Yes.
Future projects? Not at the moment, but, but this has sort of been the way it's been. We work on something, then the wave kind of crests, and then on one day the phone rings and he calls me with some crazy idea, and I go, okay, and off we go again.
How has a little bit of a DC editorial changed over the years? You talked about being shielded back in the original run.
They've gotten a lot stupider.
This is why he's not on Twitter.
Sorry.
I'll give you one observation about the business in general, how it's changed over the years. Used to be, the ideas were primarily, at least this is my experience, I can't speak for everyone, the ideas were primarily generated by the creative people. And then things began to shift, and then suddenly it became ideas were being generated above, and this is the new crossover we're doing, and so it became a little more the way they do it, in Hollywood, a little more input from above, as opposed to let's let the creative people just have their head and go and create, and we'll build on what they create. So there's I think maybe it feels a little more corporate sometimes,
It's also the editors have I'm not a huge fan of editors, in case you can't tell. I just remember sitting down with the editor of Lobo, and we were talking about the plot of me and Alan Grant and the editor were just taking over the book with name names. And at one point, he turns to me, talking about, he goes, Keith, I really don't think Lobo would do that. And I created the characters. And all I remember is Alan Grant and a cup of tea, and just take a sip out of it, and he did a spit take and looked right at his face and went, "Are you daft, man?" That's my dealings with editors now are having game video call me up and go, "Stop it, no one wants to call." Yeah. Editors are ballast. Ballast. They're what you throw off the balloon to make the balloon go higher.
Space palms, sir.
Costello. I've had many great relationships with wonderful editors just to balance that. And let's go back to Andy Helfer, one of the best editors ever, and fantastic. Many great editors, many great editors. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Speaking of changes to comics over the years, how do you feel about them becoming so decompressed and being very great?
Decompressed comics are ridiculous because you're not getting your money's worth. I don't want to read a comic book that takes place in 15 minutes. I don't want to read a comic book at 15-minute intervals in this clown's life. It's like,
I also think decompress can be done badly, and it can be, if decompress means that you're giving maybe the plot room to breathe, but you're taking that room to really dive deeper into the story and explore the characters more deeply and bring more nuance, that's good. If it just means that you're taking a 5-page story and stretching it out to 22 pages, that's not good. Some years back, I hadn't seen a batch of recent comics, and I was actually doing a writing workshop, and someone brought a batch of recent comics. And I was reading this one book, and it was really good, and I was really enjoying it. But it was over, like, on page 6. And then I realized page 6 was page 22, because there was not a lot of story there. And I know Keith's instinct and my instinct is always, fill that thing up with story and character and incidents, and let's have fun with this and give people their money's worth.
I saw Initial Green Arrow one time, and the story.
See, he's not afraid to name names.
I'm not gonna name the artist, but there was the full-page shot was a full-pager, a black canary looking in the refrigerator, and then a 2-page spread that showed the contents of the refrigerator.
This comic is out there.
This is really true?
This is really true.
Wow.
And I just thought,
Did the refrigerator eat her on the next page or anything like that? No, no.
She pulled out something.
And she ate a sandwich for 5 pages?
And I'm just really, it's like no.
But it's like any other form, decompression. Like I said, you can do it well or you can do it poorly. And I think some people did it well, then a lot of other people saw that and then did it poorly.
Well, we're coming out the end of the panel. I just want to, I guess the last question would be, any closing thoughts on the impact that your work has had? I mean, there's a room full of people here turned out for it. No closing thoughts.
When we did it, people enjoyed it. Thank you very much for enjoying it. Thank you for buying it. It's how I managed to make a living. But
If I start thinking of the impact that I have, but then, I think I'm going to get derailed. I just want to tell a story. I don't want to think of the impact it's going to have. I don't want to start thinking that I'm going to affect somebody's life. I'm not going to affect anyone's life. They'll read the book. Maybe somebody will get something out of it. That's great, but that's not what I'm doing it for. I'm doing it to make a living. And, it's a fun job. It's a great job. But basically, if you don't pay me, I'm not going to do it.
I will contradict him a little bit. We come to these conventions and people come up to talk about these stories and how much these stories, I don't know, forget about impact. I don't mean impact on the industry. But if they've had an impact on somebody's life and they say, I was reading these books and at a hard time in my life, or this was the first, they've carried these stories with them for years. And not only that, they've been reprinting these stories and people are discovering them again for the first time. And I really appreciate that. I appreciate the passion that people have for these stories. It's 30 years later. We never thought we'd be having a conversation about this. The job was over, the job was over. We thought that's the end of that. And here we are, last year they put out that giant omnibus and we sit at these conventions and at least a third of what I sign, I'm still working and busy, but a third of what I sign is Justice League because people love it. And I'm very grateful that they love it. Impact, that's another, maybe it's the wrong word, but there's a lot of gratitude on my end for what we get from people at these conventions.
I mean, like me personally, it impacted me. I think everybody in here, this run, it impacted them personally.
Well, you're right.
We worked on Justice League. We did our Justice League, but Trump is still president.